I'm the Clinical Director for Baby Friendly USA, and I will be presenting today about fair market price requirements and hopefully making sure that by the time everyone leaves, you'll have a better understanding of the Baby Friendly USA fair market price requirements. But before I get started with that information, just a few preliminary slides. I do need to disclose that, of course, I'm employed with Baby Friendly USA, but beyond that, I have no other conflicts of interest. And just to let you know, this presentation is not supported by any funds from companies that violate the international code. Also, I want to make sure everybody understands that the information presented during this webinar is current as of today, December 6, 2017. And so if anybody is viewing this as a recorded version of this webinar, it's very important that you understand it's the responsibility of the viewer to confirm that the information presented is up to date, and you do that by reviewing the information on the Baby Friendly USA website portal. So the goal of this webinar today is to understand the Baby Friendly USA fair market price requirements, and I say that understanding that the fair market price requirements are probably the most misunderstood and confusing requirements for a lot of hospitals going through the 40 pathway, and it's the requirements that we receive the most questions about and that hospitals fail the most during the on-site assessment. So it's a really lofty goal, but I definitely think that you will have a better understanding of the requirements after this presentation, and I'm going to help you understand those fair market price requirements by, number one, providing you with some background for the requirements, by number two, discussing the options for determining fair market price compliance that are available, and I say options because there's two options now. I'm going to also discuss the fair market price toolkit, so you'll know what the fair market price toolkit is when we're done with the webinar. And then at the end, I'm going to wrap up with reviewing a few frequently asked questions that we receive from hospitals in the 40 pathway. So those are our objectives, and we will start looking at a little bit of the background around fair market price, because it's helpful sometimes to know where things came from to understand where we're going. Okay, and let me just see, let me just switch, okay, I'm back. But Moon, it looks like I lost my presenter privileges. Hang on. Okay. I don't have, I'm sorry guys, I don't have the presenter privileges anymore. Okay, let's see, it looks like, here we go. Okay, so back to the webinar. Sorry about that. So a little bit of background. Most of you guys know that one of the components of the Baby Friendly Hospital Initiative is that facilities are required to purchase breast milk substitutes or formula and other infant feeding products at fair market prices. And so that's a component. And in 2009, the World Health Organization issued global guidance for implementing this requirement. So the World Health came out with their guidance, and they said hospitals can pay wholesale prices or hospitals could pay 80% of retail. And for a country where most hospitals are paying nothing for these products, we knew that that was a really lofty goal, and we knew that there was going to have to be some U.S. modification for this requirement. So we did adapt the criteria some, or the guidance some, and in 2010, Baby Friendly created the retail comparison methodology, and that was meant to reflect a hospital's, hang on just a second, I keep losing my presenter privileges.
Sorry, somebody just keep taking the presenter privilege.
Okay. Just wait till they don't have it back yet. I'll just wait just a moment. It's okay. These kind of things happen. All right. So we created in 2010 the retail comparison methodology, and that was meant to reflect a hospital's individual facility purchasing power, or to say it a different way, to reflect the discount rates that your hospital is getting. So some hospitals may be able to get their products discounted at 50%, some might get them at 10%, but we knew that there was a difference, so we created that retail comparison methodology in 2010 to reflect each individual facility's purchasing power. And we published the tool, the Attestation of Purchase of Breast Milk Substitutes. And so some of you may have seen that tool. It was titled or it was often called just the Attestation. And so that tool came out in 2010, but we got a lot of feedback from hospitals that retail comparison methodology was administratively difficult, it was burdensome, and then also just that document itself, the attestation, was confusing to hospitals. It wasn't really clear to hospitals what they were supposed to do or what the requirements were. So we took all that feedback, we heard it, and we began working to try to streamline our requirements and try to make it more clear to hospitals. And that's how we came to creating the Fair Market Price Toolkit, which I'll be discussing more in detail in a little bit. But the Fair Market Price Toolkit, it includes two options now for determining fair market price compliance. So previously there was just one option, and now currently there are two options for determining fair market price compliance. And they're presented in that Fair Market Price Toolkit, which was posted to the Baby Friendly website portal on June 2nd of 2017. So hopefully most of you have been able to go to the portal and log in and download this Fair Market Price Toolkit. If you are a hospital that's in the pathway and you're in at least the development phase, you will have access to the Fair Market Price Toolkit. So if you haven't had a chance to do that yet, please do it as soon as we get done with this presentation. Log into the portal, download the Fair Market Price Toolkit documents, and I'm going to explain a little bit here in just a few minutes what those documents are. But let's first talk about the fair market price compliance options. So I've already told you there's two options. Our new option, option 1, is minimum threshold price. And then option 2 is the retail comparison methodology. So that's the method that has been in place since 2010, but we did create a new option, minimum threshold price. So let's talk about that one. Let's talk about that one first, option 1, minimum threshold price. So how we created this option was by taking data from 160 facilities that were designated in 2015 and after. So we took all that data, we looked at all the products that hospitals were purchasing, infant feeding products, I should say. We looked at those items, and we came up with 9 different categories of feeding items. And so you can see those categories right there. There's the ready-to-use formula or water, powdered formula, concentrated liquid formula. There's bottles, which includes bottles for storage, like a storage of express breast milk or just feeding bottles. There's bottle caps, human milk fortifier liquid, human milk fortifier powder, nipples, and pacifiers. So that right there is the 9 categories that we determined to be infant feeding product categories that hospitals were purchasing. And then we calculated mean prices for those feeding categories. We went one standard deviation below those mean prices, and we came up with minimum threshold prices for each category. So for every one of these 9 categories, you see again on the screen, every one of these 9 categories, we came up with a minimum threshold price. But what is minimum threshold price? What does that mean? So you know there's a price for each category, but what does that really mean? What that is, the minimum threshold price is the price that a facility was required to be at or above. So you have to be paying at least that minimum threshold price or above that price for each category. So let me just give you an example. For the ready-to-use formula category, the minimum threshold price is 9 cents. So for all of your ready-to-use formulas, your hospital is required to be paying at least 9 cents or above. I mean, you can certainly pay more than that, but minimally for that that category, the items in that category, the ready-to-use feeding items would have to be 9 cents or above would be what your facility would have to be paying to be compliant. And so this option is definitely, it's easier administratively, and there's less documentation required. So it's our streamlined option. Just to help make it a little bit more concrete, this table that you're seeing now is a table that facilities who are using this option, option 1, would be required to complete and to submit to us. And so you see there, column A is those 9 products or 9 product categories again. Column B there is the product sizes, and then column C is the minimum threshold prices. Now, for this presentation, because this is a confidential document, the prices, you just see the X's there, but if you actually go onto the website portal, so if you're a hospital in the pathway, you go into the portal, you will be able to actually see the minimum threshold prices for all of these categories. And so I did already tell you the example of that first category there for the ready-to-use formula. The minimum threshold price is 9 cents. And then continuing on in the table, you see column D, that's the facility cost of each item you would list. And in order to be compliant, and let me back up, you would list the least expensive item in that category. So for example, for the ready-to-use formula category, you would list your least expensive ready-to-use formula. And minimally, you would have to be paying at least 9 cents to be compliant. So the facility cost that you list in column D, that has to be at least the same price that's listed in column C to be compliant. So that's how minimum threshold price, or option 1, works to determine fair market price compliance. Now, we also have option 2, which is our retail comparison method that's been in place since 2010. We didn't want to take that away from hospitals. We understand some hospitals still may need to utilize that. And so the retail comparison method, it determines a facility's purchasing power by calculating the margin of retail paid for other items. Let me just say that one more time because that's a lot to take in. The retail comparison method, it determines a facility's purchasing power by calculating the margin of retail, or sometimes called the percentage range of retail, for other maternity items. So the way that you do that is you determine your cost for 5 maternity items. So you pick 5 maternity items, randomly choose 5 maternity items, and you find out what is our hospital paying for these 5 maternity items. Then you go find out what is the retail price of these 5 maternity items. So you know what your hospital pays for them, and you find out what the retail price of them is, and that's how you determine your margin of retail or your percentage range of retail that you're paying. So to make it a little bit more concrete, let me show you this next slide. Let me say this first. The facility must pay within or above the margin of retail that's calculated. So whatever that margin of retail that you determined by comparing your facility cost and your retail of those items, you have to be paying within or above that margin. And again, it was the same method that was used on the attestation. Now, to make it a little bit more concrete for you, let me just give you an example of this. And these products and these prices are completely examples. They're not accurate. They're not. So please don't get upset if you see, oh, our hospital pays way more than that or whatever. Please don't think that. It's just completely for example purposes. But if your hospital has chosen to use option 2, or the retail comparison method, this table right here would be a table that you would be required to complete. And so you can see in column A that there's the 5 commonly used items. So in this example, there's the newborn diaper, the baby shampoo, the maternity pad, the bulb syringe, and the parental ice pack. In column B, we do get you to use or to list the brand that the facility uses. And that's because the reason we ask for a brand is because you need to be comparing the retail and the facility cost of the same brand. We have in the past had hospitals, they would be using a very generic brand of an item, but then when they went to find the retail price, they would find the most high-end designer brand. For example, you know, it's not a good comparison to compare the little cheap baby caps compared to designer baby caps. So we do want you to try to use the same brands if possible. Then in column C, your hospital will list what your facility is paying for those items. Column D, you will list the retail price for those items. And then column E is where you calculate the percentage that you're paying. So you can see for the newborn diapers, the hospital in this example is paying 50% of the retail price for the diapers and 30% of the retail price for the shampoo, and so on. So you can see that their lowest percentage that they're paying is 8% and their highest is 50%. But that's how you calculate the percent of retail that you're paying. And then you have to take it one more, or actually two more steps. And the next step is to record that margin of retail. So this, again, would be a table that you would complete, and you have to record your lowest percentage of retail paid. So in this example was 8%, and the highest percent, and this was, in this example, 50%. And that's your margin of retail. So you're paying 8 to 50% of the retail price for maternity items. And so to be compliant, your hospital has to pay for your feeding products. So for your formula and for your other feeding products, you would have to be paying in that range. So in this example, you would have to be paying in between 8 to 50% of retail for your infant feeding products and your formula. I mean, certainly you can pay more than that, but minimally you have to pay in that range. And then with option 2, there's one more step. So you've figured out your range, and you have to determine, are our products in that range? And so again, this is a table you would complete. It looks a lot like the option 1 table. You see, again, the infant feeding product categories, the product sizes, the brand, and then you would record, in each category, you're going to record your least expensive item. So whatever your least expensive ready-to-use formula, least expensive powdered formula, you record it there in column D. And then in column E, you have to tell us what the retail price for that item is. So you have to do a little more work. And then in column F, you have to calculate what the percent of retail is. So your percentage of retail that you determine in column F, it has to again fall in that margin of retail that you've calculated. So it's a bit more of a process here to determine option 2. But again, if your facility chooses to do that, you certainly are able to. But how do you decide? How should your facility decide? Should we go with option 1 or should we go with option 2 to determine our fair market price compliance? So I have an algorithm here, just kind of give your hospital an idea of how you might make that decision. So we definitely encourage all hospitals to start off with option 1. Again, it's our streamlined method, less documentation required, less burdensome to administration. So we encourage all hospitals to start off with option 1. And if your hospital is in compliance with option 1, great. That's excellent. So what you'll just need to do is prepare your documentation and be ready for the on-site assessment. If you're non-compliant with option 1, then you can certainly see if option 2 would work for you. So you would fill out all the information, see if you're compliant with option 2. If it turns out you are compliant with option 2, then great. Again, prepare your documentation for on-site assessment and you're ready. If you fill out your information and you realize we're not compliant with option 1, we're not compliant with option 2, what's going to have to happen is your facility is going to have to amend your contracts to be either compliant with option 1 or 2. You're going to have to renegotiate your contracts to make sure that your infant feeding products and your formula that you are paying fair market prices for. Okay, so we're going to move on to talk about the Fair Market Price Toolkit. So hopefully you all have at least a little bit of an understanding so far about the different options, option 1 and option 2. And now I want to talk about the Fair Market Price Toolkit. So again, remember the Fair Market Price Toolkit, it was released on our Baby Friendly USA website portal this past June, in June 2017, and it includes 4 documents. There is the Fair Market Price Toolkit Guide, and I'll be talking about that shortly. The second document is the rationale for fair market price of infant feeding supplies. All I really want to say about the rationale is it's a resource tool for you who are really the leads or the multidisciplinary committee members. It's a tool for you to take to your colleagues in the rest of the hospital, because we understand that when you go to your administration or you go to your purchasing department and you say, hey, we want to do this baby-friendly designation thing, and one of the requirements is that we have to pay for our formula, that is very counter to most business practices. Like most business, protocol says if we can get something for free, great. And so that's very confusing to other people in the hospital. So this is a resource tool that you can give to those colleagues in your hospital, and you can say, hey, this is why this is important. This is why we really need to be paying for those products and not getting them for free. So that's a great resource for you, because it's hard to explain to people who aren't really, knee-deep in the work and doing it on a daily basis. The third document is the Fair Market Price Code Compliance Verification Form, and I'll talk about that form here more in just a minute. And then there's the Fair Market Price On-Site Assessment Preparation Grid, which is a documentation tool that you'll have to present during the on-site assessment. And so these documents, again, are available to hospitals in the 40 pathway when they reach the development phase. And please, if you're in the development phase, if you're in the dissemination phase, go ahead, print these documents, understand them. We do not require your hospital to start purchasing products until, at least, you have to have at least 3 months worth of purchase of the products. But if you wait until the very end, if you wait until designation phase, it's a very much of a mad dash at the end. So it's really important that you understand these requirements and everybody in your hospital understands them early on in your journey to baby-friendly designation. But let's talk about the Fair Market Price, the Toolkit Guide. So the guide, you need to read this document first. It's very important that you read it first before you jump to any of the other documents, and that's because it contains instructions for meeting our requirements, and it's going to give you guidance for a variety of procurement scenarios. And so it never ceases to amaze us, just when we think we've heard about all the different ways hospitals or healthcare systems purchase and how all that plays out. Almost on a daily basis, we get new information from a hospital, and it can just be very complex. So definitely look at that. It will give you some guidance on there about different scenarios for procurement. And then also it gives some proof of payment examples, which seems to be previously such an issue for hospitals. I know before I was the clinical director, I was an on-site assessor, and very often hospitals struggled at the on-site assessment with producing the correct proof of payment. So it's real important to read that. But most importantly, this guide is going to give you directions for completing the Fair Market Price Code Compliance Verification Form. So you got to have the guide to complete this compliance verification form. We get a lot of questions about this form. How do we complete it? What information should we conclude? And often the answers are in this guide. So don't just jump to filling out the form. Make sure you read the guide, because the guide has directions for filling out each section on the form. And so some of you are saying, but what is the form? So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the Fair Market Price Code Compliance Verification Form. And that is a mouthful, that is a long title. So I'm going to just be calling it the F&P form from here on out. So the F&P form. And here's just a screenshot of the F&P form. And what the F&P form is, it's the document that hospitals are going to submit to Baby Friendly USA to verify compliance with fair market price, and also to verify compliance with the international code. And this F&P form, it replaces that attestation document I told you about earlier. So gone is that confusing document that everybody was so ready to get rid of, and now we have the F&P form. the F&P form will list the two options for showing fair market price compliance. So it has an option, or it has a section, excuse me, for option 1, and then it has a section for option 2. So your facility will choose one of those options, and you're going to complete the tables relevant to each option. So if your facility decides you're going to choose option 1, you're going to complete the option 1 table, and if you want to complete the option, or if you want to choose option 2, you're going to complete the option 2 tables. Please understand, you can't fill out both options. You can't fill out all the tables and send them to us. You got to choose. I mean, certainly as your multidisciplinary committee team is trying to figure out what works for you, you might do that. But when you submit it to us, we only want to see the section filled out for either option 1 or for option 2. So I think most of you guys will fall into this category. Facilities that did not complete a readiness assessment interview by June 15th of 2017, you're required to use this F&P form. So you probably won't even see the attestation. So again, if you did not complete a readiness assessment interview and you have to be in designation phase, if you didn't do that by June 15, 2017, then you will use the F&P form. Our annual QI phase, so that's the phase after designation, beginning in 2018, those facilities will use the F&P form. And then our current redesignation cycle, those hospitals are already using the form. And I'm not sure any hospitals on the line will fall into this category, but if your hospital is already designated, they can begin to use the new form at any time. They're certainly able to do that. They don't have to submit it until it's requested by us. So let's talk about documentation, because like I just told you, when I was an on-site assessor and then now as a clinical director, there are just so much, for whatever reason, confusion and questions about the documentation that is required during the on-site assessment to show, you know, that the formula and the feeding products are actually being purchased at the fair market prices. So let's talk about what documentation your facility is going to need during the on-site assessment. So all hospitals, whether you've chosen option 1 or option 2, you are going to complete the on-site assessment preparation grid. And so this is a tool that's going to help your facility organize all your infant feeding products and your formula. It's going to help you organize your invoices and your proof of payment. You're going to complete this form before the assessment, and then at the time of the assessment, when the assessors arrive on day 1, you're going to give them this on-site preparation grid, and it's going to evaluate your invoices and your proof of payments. And it makes for a much more streamlined process, whereas previously there was a lot of time spent, and we want to focus on the actual maternity care practices, and we don't want to spend all our time looking at your invoices, which we certainly will, but we want it to be in the most streamlined process that it can be. Also for option 1 and 2, all facilities are required to provide 3 months of invoices and the corresponding proof of payment. So we need to see 3 months of invoices and 3 months of that corresponding payment for your formula and for your feeding products. So you can't just give us invoices, because that just tells us that you ordered those products. And you can't just give us a proof of payment, because we would have no way of knowing what that payment went for. You can't just give us a, you know, we just had one hospital recently say they were going to give us show us a $9 million check. Well, how would we know what that $9 million check goes for? So we have to see the invoice, and we have to see the correlating proof of payment. We have to see how they're related. We have to know that that proof of payment, that payment is for those products on that invoices. So we need to see both of those together, not one or the other. And what are some examples, or what are some types of proof of payment that we will accept? And again, this has been just a big issue for hospitals to understand, but I want to clear that up for you. So we will accept canceled checks, and I say canceled checks because we need to make sure that the payment actually went through. We have in the past had cases where a hospital actually wrote the check and the formula company didn't cash it. So we need to see a canceled check. We need to confirm that the payment actually went through. And of course, nowadays, most hospitals are all electronic, so we would accept an ACH transaction receipt or screenshot of that. So that's just basically electronic banking showing us how the funds were transferred, very similar to a bank statement. Again, just showing us that who the funds were transferred to and where they went and what they represent. And then in some cases, like when we work with birthing centers or smaller hospitals, they sometimes purchase these products so infrequently that they are able to just go to like a local retail store and just buy the products at full retail price. And so we would accept a retail receipt as well. So that's the type of documentation we would accept. For option 2, I need everybody to understand that for option 2, additional documentation is required because remember, there's a whole other step of you have to determine what the margin of retail or the percentage of retail that you're paying for those maternity items. And then you have to also show us the retail price for your formula and your infant feeding products. So there's a whole lot of extra documentation that's required. I'm not going to get into all of it right now. I'm just going to say it's very clear in the Fair Market Price Toolkit Guide and the F&P form what documentation is required, but please just understand that there is extra documentation that is going to have to be available during the on-site assessment, and it's really important that you keep up with this documentation. It's very common that hospitals will say, oh, we looked at those prices, we found them 2 years ago. I have no idea what they are. So it's real important to understand what that extra documentation is going to be. Okay, so now let me go through a few frequently asked questions. So we have been getting a lot of questions since we released our new Fair Market Price Toolkit and we released our new option 1, our minimum threshold price option. So I've summarized them, just a few of them, and hopefully if you guys have some of these questions, I'll be able to answer them as I go through. So probably, believe it or not, the most common question that we get about option 1 is, does the minimum threshold price for the ready-to-feed formula category, does it apply to specialty formulas? So I told you the minimum threshold price for that ready-to-feed category is 9 cents. And does that 9 cents, does that mean that the specialty NICU formulas, which are usually way more expensive, but is it the same? And the answer is yes. And this is really good news for a lot of hospitals who have NICUs who are purchasing a lot of specialty formulas. It has been a big barrier in the past, but our minimum threshold price is the same for your regular newborn formulas as it is for your specialty formulas. Another frequently asked question, and this applies to both option 1 and 2, is, what is our facility supposed to do if we purchase feeding products that don't fall into those 9 categories that were listed? So remember I told you there's 9 categories. What if your hospital has a product that doesn't really fit into one of those 9 categories? And so, for example, alternative feeding devices like cups or curved tip syringes or SNSs, where do you put those? What category is that supposed to fall in? Well, the answer is that we certainly expect that your facility is paying for these products, and if it's you're getting those products from like a formula company or from another infant feeding product manufacturer, you certainly cannot get them for free. That would be against our criteria, but we are not going to require you to submit the information to us at this time. And some of the rationale is that in our experience as we've done these assessments and we've looked at the data, we really haven't ran into any hospitals that weren't paying fair market price for those items. We don't have the capacity to look at everything, but again, we do expect that you are paying for these, and if it was to come to our attention that you weren't or you were getting them for free, that would violate our criteria. But we're not going to ask you to submit that information to us right now. So another frequently asked question, and I think I've made this clear, but just want to make sure everybody gets it. Can facilities use a combination of option 1 and option 2 to determine fair market price? And again, the answer is no. You got to choose either option 1 or option 2. No combo deal, but you got to make a choice. And the next question that applies to both option 1 and option 2. What should a facility do if they purchase items that are larger, larger sized, than what is listed in the FMP form. So for example, remember I showed you those columns that had the product sizes, and the product size listed for the ready-to-feed formula was 2 to 3 ounces. But what about if your facility is purchasing products that are bigger? So what if you purchase a 6-ounce bottle of formula? You know, are you expected to pay for higher? What we expect is that you're paying fair market price for those products, and we would expect that your facility would be paying higher for those larger sized items. You know, for example, if your hospital buys a 250 ml bag of fluid, it's pretty normal that you would be paying more for a 500 ml bag of fluid. So it would be the same thing here. If you're paying a certain amount for a 3-ounce bottle, we could probably assume that you're going to pay more for a 6-ounce bottle, not necessarily double, but more. That being said, our minimal criteria is that you have to be paying at least the minimum threshold price or within the margin of retail. So at the end of the day, could you pay the same thing for 6-ounce nursery that you're paying for a 2 to 3 ounce nursery? Yes. You just have to be paying the minimum threshold price for that category or be paying within the margin of retail. So for option 2, a frequent question is what products can be used for the commonly used maternity items. So we definitely want you to choose random items, but what you cannot do, you cannot use breast milk substitutes, you cannot use formula, you cannot use infant feeding products, and you can't use any products that you receive for free. So, but other than that, we really don't have any limitations on what maternity items you can choose. And for option 2, what sources can you use to find your retail prices? Because you're going to have to find retail prices for your maternity items, and you're going to have to find retail prices for your formula and feeding products. You can find those retail prices through a local retail outlet. You can find it through a online store, but it has to be a credible, established online store. It cannot be a bidding website. So we were having some hospitals that were going to like bidding websites, for example, like eBay, and they were giving us these just really low bids. They're not true retail prices. So if you use the online store, it has to be a credible, established, non-bidding website. And then finally, when do facilities in the 40 pathway receive access to the Fair Market Price Toolkit? Again, I think I've said this a few times, but want to just really reiterate it. If you're in the LISA development phase, you have access to that toolkit. So go online, go into the portal, download those documents, print them out, and then if you have any questions, definitely submit them to info@babyfriendlyusa.org. Any question that has to do with the criteria, which includes fair market pricing, that will be forwarded to me. I'm happy to answer. We usually try to answer questions via email first, just because of our high volume of questions that we get, but we can certainly schedule a time to talk if we need to do that. So that's all I have. That's the end of my presentation, and I think we may have time to do some questions if we have any.